So where are we? Where do we go from there? How powerful is democracy? How close are we to the edge? What happens now?
Well, the deal about democracy, especially American democracy, is that it's supposed to be a participation event. You know, we've got this wonderful thing called the Constitution. I'd like Americans to start reading the Constitution and understanding what that document means. That way, maybe people wouldn't sit there and say, well, Scott Ritter, it's pie in the sky, Plato's Republic. No, it's not. It's what we stand for. It's what the values and ideals of our nation are. They're enshrined in that document. And there's no other document in the world like it. But the fact that most Americans have it, you know, my wife comes from the former Soviet Union. She had to actually study the Constitution and take a test on the Constitution before she became a citizen. And so she knows the Constitution better than the vast majority of natural-born Americans. And so Americans need to start to come to grips of who they are, because unless you know the Constitution and understand what representative democracy means, and that's not just about voting people in, it's about holding people accountable for what they do in your name, then you're not a citizen, and that's what we lack, is citizenship.
But let me ask you this. As somebody who knows the military pretty well, what about the failure of the military to speak out? I mean, what do you think? I know there's no answer, but what do you think?
I have a hard time blaming the military for this. You know, there's a gentleman, he's a colonel on active duty today, H.R. McMaster, that wrote a great book about the Vietnam War called Dereliction of Duty. And it's about the failure of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to stand up and do the right thing about Vietnam. And the same dereliction of duty is taking place today by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Yes, I agree. There comes a time when you're a senior officer in the U.S. military, when you see the civilian leadership behaving in the manner that they are, it's not about picking up the phone and calling a journalist, and I know that would do you great harm if they stopped doing that, but it's about taking the stars off your collar and throwing them on the table and say, I will not be a part of this charade, and nobody's been willing to do that.
But let's get back to reality. Where's McMaster now, do you know?
Well, McMaster's a brigade commander in Iraq. I think he just ran combat operations in Tal Afar.
He was the brigade commander in Tal Afar. I can tell you just from, that's the operation that took place a few months ago in northern Iraq. The worst part of it took place during Katrina. There were men in the military who were very happy about the lack of American attention. Well, of course, it's been dwindling anyway. At one point, I'm told, we had more than 100 raids, air raids on that village. I've had officers come back and use the word genocide and talk about turning in their colonel. What is it, bird? Wings?
Birds, yeah.
What is it? Turning in his...
They're full bird colonels, his eagle wings.
His eagles, okay, turning in his eagles. Talking to me about what they consider to be genocide, and at one point the Turkish Red Crescent, the Red Cross from Turkey, came across and offered to provide some support for the 200,000 people of Tal Afar that had been bombed, given in obscurity because of Katrina, and they were told no by us. And so what is the system that makes a guy like McMaster, who could write such a brilliant book, about which the generals still talk? They still get together, the generals still talk about their lack of morality or amorality or whatever it is. They worry about it in their own private meetings. I've talked to people who've gone, they meet together 3 or 4 times a year. So what is it about this war, this president? Where are we with this stuff? What's going to happen? Who's going to break out and tell us? The war there, in case anybody has any illusions, if you were to read the Arab press about what's going on every day, when we have stories talking about guys in the New York Times the other day, maybe yesterday, pilots flying supersonic jets saying they saw 25 to 40 insurgents go into a building, so they destroyed the building, killing that many insurgents. Insurgents is the new word for body count. And it just goes down so smoothly. I just see it happen. The press just automatically glams onto the notion that everybody we say is an insurgent is, and yet if you look at El Hayat and the other press, and you get a sense every day those papers are filled with little children dying, being maimed, and the amount of hatred that's being generated against us, the amount of resentment, the number of jihadists we're creating. The war in Iraq is not an external war, it's an indigenous war, and it's getting worse. So why not blame the military? Why not say one of those guys should speak out?
Well, I'm not saying that they shouldn't speak out. I mean, you know, it would be wonderful, and it's not pressure on H.R. McMaster's, but if he set the example, if he came back from Iraq and said, this is a war that's not only unwinnable, but this is a war that's morally unacceptable, and I can no longer participate in this conflict, and he resigned. Who knows, that might set the standard for other men of honor to step forward, but it's a very difficult thing to ask a soldier to do what the average American citizen won't. I mean, why do we put the burden on the soldier to speak out instead of putting the burden on the American public to become more empowered, to become enraged about what's happening, to vote out of office? We got an election coming up in 2006. Rather than waiting for McMaster's to resign, why don't we vote out of Congress everybody who voted in favor of this war?
Well,
and I know I don't live in reality, but it's still...
well, so let's talk about the press a minute. We got to get to that a little bit. And you're going to want, I think we're going to want questions eventually, right? Let me read you some stuff that was said about you. This is my favorite one, actually. I'm not picking on the New York Times, but it just happens to be my favorite one. It was a long piece that was done about Scott in the fall of '02. 5 months, November. Would have been 5 months before the invasion. And the headline of the piece is Scott Ritter, it's a magazine piece, Scott Ritter's Iraq Complex. And it says, war definitely is Ritter's prediction. He told me this the other day. He sees no room for optimism. He said, he was talking about the Security Council at this time, if you remember, the Bush administration and Blair, the eternal puppy dog, I guess, were talking about going back to the UN, and he said it's just a setup, a smoke screen. The Bush administration has put his reputation on the line. This is Scott talking. Whether or not weapons are found, expect the bombing to begin. He says, he talked about, Scott is quoted as saying, the presidential palaces in Iraq may have underground bunkers, but they're not underground factories. Quote, there's no James Bond, there's no Dr. Evil, the Iraqis are incompetent, they can't do it. And my favorite line is the next one, well, maybe they could. So why couldn't you get the press to take you seriously?
Well, one of the problems is that the press wasn't looking to have a discussion based on reality, because that's too nuanced, that's too complicated, that's too gray. The press wanted black and white. And it also, the problem was, you know, you have this former Marine, former hard-nosed weapons inspector, who
was bitching a lot about the Iraqis all along,
yeah,
and their capability. Right,
yeah,
go ahead.
A man singled out by Saddam Hussein as, you know, the personification of evil, suddenly gone soft. And that was just a combination that the press didn't know how to deal with.
You flip-flop, they said.
I was a flip-flopper. And so rather than deal with the complexity of a problem, and believe me, there's no single answer to many of these questions. The WMD issue in the lead up to the war was one that I was not saying that Iraq had no WMD. I said that the inspectors had never completed their job. We needed to let the inspectors go back in and finish the job before we talk about going to war. That when the president says that there can be no doubt that there's WMD in Iraq, that implies certainty of knowledge that has to be based upon fact, and that this administration had failed to put any of that fact on the table. And all I was asking is that the administration make its case, because short of that case, we can't talk about going to war. We need to let the inspectors do their job. And that's too complicated for Barry Birack, that author, and other people out there who, frankly speaking, didn't know how to deal with this guy called Ritter and the message he was trying to put out there.
But in terms of Saddam, do you think maybe we need fixes? We need a Hitler fix? Seems to me that we've gone from Hitler, we go to Stalin, we go to Mao, we go to Zhou Enlai, we go to Khrushchev, we go to, at some point, Gaddafi, certainly Khomeini. You run through the list. We seem to always be fixated on, you know, Dr. Evil, I guess, to use that cliche. So is that it, that we're so easily brainwashed into thinking that Saddam, who's by nobody's suggesting that he's not, you know, this is despicable, etc. Let's make that, there's no apology here, obviously, for him. But there are an awful lot of very bad people out there.